Okay, we are live. And joining us today, it's returning champion Kit Klarenberg, who is coming to us from the center of the storm, perhaps, or close to the center of the storm. Coming to us from Belgrade. And Kit's here today to talk about, amongst other things, his work on potential Slovakian color revolutions in light of the so far attempted assassination of Slovak Premier Robert Fico yesterday. So, Kit, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Alex. I think repeat offender is perhaps a better descriptor than
perhaps so.
Returning champion. But yeah, no, always a pleasure, never a burden, my friend.
Yeah, excellent. So we are live on YouTube and on Twitter. So Kit returns to Twitter in visual form, even though, of course, you are banned by free speech fundamentalist Elon Musk for, amongst other things, criticizing the likes of Paul Mason.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's quite remarkable because I was suspended 3 months ago. I was told variously that I would be gone for a month, that my ban was permanent, or indeed I'll be back after 3 months. And I received an email yesterday saying that yes, we've reviewed our decision and no, your ban will be permanent because you advocated violence. Now, I mean, I've spent a significant proportion of my time on Twitter ever since I registered opposing any and all violence, particularly the imperialist kind. I mean, yet, funnily enough, I still receive notification emails from Twitter telling me that a report I filed about a hardcore Zionist who advocated me being beaten daily for my political views. They've investigated it and found no rules were broken. So oppose genocide, get done for forever on a free speech platform. I strongly suspect that, yes, our dear friend Tinker Tailor Soldier Spice, Paul Mason, who is now running for Jeremy Corbyn's seat at last after lots of in Islington North running to get the nomination. I think this is the fifth or sixth time he's done this. What a scumbag! But like the fact that he's going to try and seize Jeremy Corbyn's seat, I think this would it might be enough to draw me back to the UK to support Jeremy's campaign and ensure that British intelligence asset does not end up in Parliament. Although I suppose the Labour Party is already run by one, so
yeah,
whether that would be a particularly substantive difference, I'm not sure. But yeah, so I mean, I think that in respect of what's happened with Mr. Fico, who is the long-time repeat Slovak leader, the situation is still emerging. The culprit who shot at him, I think 5 or 6 times, and he was hit 4 times, twice in the gut, which is not like the last place in the world you want to get shot. Pretty much, it is somewhat miraculous that he had an initial operation and his condition was said to be stable, but apparently he's now undergoing another one. Such is the way of these things. And so slowly but surely. There have been details emerging in the media about the local media, not so much the Western media, about who did it. In the meantime, the Western media has been doing its best to, by implication and very subtly, justify this by framing Fico as a pro-Trump, pro-Orban, pro-Putin, neo-fascist, populist danger to democracy and Western civilization. In reality, Fico has historically been viewed as being of the left or centre left, and he is probably best described with this awful coinage I heard the other day, a sovereigntist. So he opposes Western interference, meddling and domination in Slovakia. This is actually, as we'll get into, a kind of long-standing Slovak position. And so it resonates, his platform has consistently resonated very kind of loudly and clearly with a significant proportion of the Slovak public. It also hasn't with another component, of course, and this is particularly the Western-backed opposition and the associated NGOs and other imperialist infrastructure that that keeps their lights on, and keeps Slovak under EU and NATO occupation, in effect. But so I think that yes, that when he won in September 30th last year, he won Slovakia's election. And it was something the Western media had been worrying about and pulling its hair out about, and again, yes, telling readers that this was going to be an absolute disaster that was going to trigger Armageddon if this happened. He has previously been Prime Minister 2006 to 2010, 2012 to 2018. His policy platform, which was explicitly on ending the sanctions against Russia, ending aid to Ukraine, and trying to restore harmonious relations with Russia, resonated with a huge proportion of the public. Now, I might add that there is a polling or think tank / polling firm in Slovakia called Globsec. They are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is in the words of its own leaders, does overtly what the CIA once did covertly. Now, it has produced numerous polls and survey data since Fico was elected, which show that, yes, according to their figures, something like 50% of the population do not blame Russia for the war. And over half consider the US to be a threat to Slovakia's security. And yes, arms sales or arms shipments to Ukraine are opposed by 70% of the public. Now, these are figures which are completely unheard of in the EU and NATO. And are sorry, Alex, what's that noise? Was that you typing?
That was just me typing. It's not Paul Mason.
Oh, right. No, you put me off. I thought you were chewing. But yeah. So in effect, yeah, these are kind of the figures which are unheard of in the EU and NATO. But you've got to add to this that given that it's NED funded, these figures are probably heavily massaged to give the kind of most favourable possible result from the US perspective. So despite that, there is huge support for the idea that this is a Western proxy war, and that this is effectively two Slavic brothers having been compelled to fight by the Anglos. It is not for nothing that the Irish have a proverb which states that if two neighbours are fighting, one of them was visited yesterday by an Englishman. Anyway, his election also came at a time when kind of Western resolve, call it that, or like unity on the proxy war in Ukraine was starting to crack. It was a time when the AfD started doing like really serious numbers in German polling, and there was open talk of maybe just banning the party, because obviously you can't have people vote for the wrong parties in a democracy, because that wouldn't be a democracy, would it? And there were also signs that that citizens across Europe were starting to ask themselves whether they were the ultimate victims of anti-Russian sanctions, and indeed whether it was worth disarming themselves in service of keeping Ukraine fighting this grinding and completely unwinnable quagmire. So his election, by definition, ran the risk of popularizing and legitimizing and indeed normalizing anti-NATO sentiment in Europe at the worst possible time from NATO's perspective. And I wrote at the time, it raises the prospect of similar governments and leaders being elected elsewhere in Europe. This has started to happen. So last week before last, that we had presidential and parliamentary elections in Macedonia. This is a very small, or North Macedonia, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, depending on who you ask. And so this is a very small Balkan country with kind of outsized geopolitical significance. They, in the middle of the last decade, the US and Britain were involved in stoking a colour revolution to get rid of the nationalist government, which was opposed to changing Macedonia's name, which was a prerequisite for the country joining the EU and NATO. And so through a variety of means, including the usual funding demonstrations and NGOs to stir up trouble, and publicising all sorts of dirty laundry about the ruling government. There was also a kind of Lavo Jato style lawfare effort. Now, Lavo Jato being this attempt to neutralise the left in Brazil by the CIA and FBI under the auspices of an anti-corruption probe. Crusade. And then the similar thing happened in Macedonia, where all sorts of anti-NATO, anti-Western government officials were indicted on completely ludicrous charges to get them out of office, to cause them legal and financial problems, or just to stigmatize them as corrupt and criminal. And so in their place, a fully Western-backed and approved and pro-NATO government was elected in 2017, and they've just lost power and in a total landslide. This is a small but seismic result, and the new government is overtly anti-NATO and has pledged that Macedonia will always be called Macedonia. So we may be looking at Macedonia being it joined NATO in March 2020, the last one in and first one out, and so and then in another. Elsewhere, we also have the protests in Georgia, where there was an opposition politician who openly declared in Parliament that there would be a colour revolution after the government passed a highly controversial Foreign Interference Act, which would compel NGOs that receive more than 20% of their foreign funding, of their funding from overseas, to declare it openly and publicly. It's considerably less draconian and destructive than the UK National Security Act, which entered into force in December last year, and we're already seeing people being prosecuted under it. And indeed, it creates all sorts of, I've written about this for the Grey Zone, all sorts of new criminal offences based on extremely vague wording that will almost inevitably result in people, British citizens, breaking the law without wanting to, without intending to, without knowing they have. And so, yes, it's been this huge bust up in Georgia for the past 18 months almost over the government's push to implement this. Now, the government has finally passed it with, I might add, the overwhelming backing of Georgia's parliament, and the Georgian Prime Minister has issued a number of extremely and indeed unprecedentedly fiery statements condemning the hypocrisy of Western countries for criticizing the legislation, and indeed criticizing the police response to these vast protests when Gestapo shock troops are smashing the heads of pro-Palestine students in every European capital and almost every US state. Now, so these are all major headwinds for the empire, and yes, and we can add to this the fact that Ukraine, the war is basically over, and US officials and the US media are openly stating the time's probably come to negotiate a truce, if not outright surrender, because Russia, with a very, very comparatively small force, is on the verge of breaking into Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city. So, and that's just the beginning, and they will no doubt not stop until they reach Odessa as well. So against this backdrop, we have Fico. You call him the first strike against the empire in Europe since the proxy war in Ukraine began. Potentially, who set off a domino effect, if not in comparable governments, but at least in public sentiment in Europe. And so in the midst of this, he gets shot. It's all rather coincidental, isn't it?
Well, it is rather, and the guy that was arrested he's a 71-year-old intellectual, a writer, who was an activist with the Slovak opposition party. He seems a rather maybe an unlikely assassin, but also perhaps typical in that seems to be a guy who was like would have been probably a rabid anti-communist back in like the 70s and the 80s, and seems to have become like a sort of rabid pro-EU guy in his later years. So perhaps the ideal man to carry out assassinations for the EU, as Dmitry Medvedev observed on his Telegram channel, the sort of dead end of the Eastern European so-called intelligentsia, driven mad by imperialist manipulations to the point of extreme violence. But you have to wonder, when it comes to the sort of color revolution type operations, and the fact that you have in Georgia a significant number, not probably the majority of Georgians, but a significant number that can be turned out by these NGO type operations, which are, as you correctly point out, intelligence operations by any other name. You have to wonder, like, why hasn't anybody learned from what happened in Ukraine? So, and what's happened elsewhere as well. Like Ukraine is going to be destroyed essentially in its current form. It won't exist for much longer. So when it comes to Georgia almost got the same treatment in 2008. Same kind of manipulations. They got prior to that, there was the Rose Revolution of, I believe, 2004, which brought the lunatic Saakashvili to power, who was determined to drive Georgia into a ditch on the orders of the Bush administration. And the same set of characters are aligning now to do the same thing in Georgia all over again. So, like, you live in a country and work in a country which was subject to this treatment over 20 years ago in 2000 with the removal of Milosevic. So what kinds of people would you say are drawn into these NGO type movements? Are they all these sort of paid actors of the US and the EU? I mean, certainly those seem to be who the organizers are. But where are they getting these crowds from? What is it about these color revolution operates that does have some resonance, and who does it have resonance with in these countries, would you say?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting point. I mean, you mentioned the history of color revolutions, and yes, the bulldozer revolution in Yugoslavia in 2000 and the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. This was all born, all of these techniques of subversion were and government overthrow, CIA coups by other means, were all minted in Slovakia. So I think, yes, that you mentioned this, the shooter's rather strange and fluctuating past. Slovakia has always had a kind of a contrarian streak, particularly since it split from Czechia or the Czech Republic, however they wish to refer to themselves these days. In I believe it was 91 or 92, and it was after the fall of communism anyway. And it was a kind of peaceful separation known as the Velvet Divorce. Now Czechia became a popular destination for Western tourists, and it painfully converted to market capitalism. By contrast, during the 90s, by contrast, Slovakia stubbornly refused to. I mean, kind of similar to how Lukashenko in Belarus was, when he came to power, very quickly reversed all the neoliberal reforms, and Belarus was the first country to kind of reach a scale of GDP that it had before the end of communism, out of the former Soviet sphere, which, you know, its economic strength endures to this day. But so Slovakia similarly was unscathed by neoliberal reforms. The prime minister, his name was Vladimir Mečiar, he openly mourned the death of the Soviet Union. He wasn't a committed communist by any means, but he understood that the Red Army's withdrawal from Europe was going to lead to US political and economic domination. and which he and indeed a significant proportion of the Slovak population were not in favour of. So, of course, come 1997, when Slovakia has insolently refused to capitulate to the demands of global capital, Madeleine Albright visited Bratislava and referred to the Slovakia openly as a black hole in the heart of Europe. So, I mean, you can consider Mečiar's political death warrant signed then and there. And thereafter, the National Endowment for Democracy started funneling money to civil society groups, activists. They staged rock concerts. They staged a Get Out the Vote campaign and all sorts of other, kind of civic campaigns, which were effectively concerned with destabilizing the government. Lots of films and quote-unquote documentaries were made and broadcast on Western-funded or owned TV stations, and Soros funded as well, broadcasting into Slovakia. And there was a concerted attempt to energize the youth, particularly, and portray capitalism, kind of the West, like Western models, as radical, as cool, as a exciting new alternative to the Ancien regime, as it were. And so in Bratislava's 1998 election, there was record youth turnout, and while Mečiar's ruling Movement for a Democratic Slovakia party won the most votes, the opposition had enough seats to form a majority in parliament and elect a pro-Western prime minister. So Mečiar didn't contest the result and stood down. I might add that there was a component of this whereby NED funded what was known as a parallel vote tabulation, which is this is to project the election's outcome in advance. And then publicize that data before the results have been officially announced. Now, in theory, this is done to prevent rigging and authorities from tinkering with figures and voting figures and other shenanigans. In reality, while that might sound benign, the scope for abuse is vast and it's very obvious. So this is exactly what happened in 2003 in Georgia, where a NED and Soros-funded parallel vote count announced the results of the election before voting was finished, and then when the official results differed from the projection, the NED-funded projection or announcement, this led to massive crowds of people in the street crying fraud and corruption, storming Parliament and demanding that Edvard Shevardnadze, who was Georgia's longtime former communist leader, resign. And so it's a very powerful tool for mobilizing activists, particularly when the NED is paying for them to be bussed into major cities, as happened in Belgrade in 2000, as happened in Ukraine in 2004 with Pora, was this youth group. So all as I mentioned, the bulldozer, it's called the bulldozer revolution because photos of Slobodan Milosevic's overthrow featured a wheel loader very prominently, and this was driven by a local Serb who used it to help activists break into government buildings and protect them from bullets, in a perverse and bitter and actually quite sad irony. The guy who drove it almost immediately became very anti-revolution, because he ran a successful independent business under Milosevic, and then due to Western imposed shock therapy on Yugoslavia after Milosevic's overthrow, his business went bankrupt, and as did he, and he lived out the rest of his days on meager state welfare payments. So be careful what you wish for. But yes, so during Bulldozer, the key component of this was a group called Otpor, which was this youth dissident group, and I think that they specifically stated that they used Coca-Cola as their model, and they were a revolution with the marketing department, and they had all sorts of assistance from US advertising professionals who were used to selling soda pop and chewing gum, who taught them on messaging, on slogans, on various kind of iconography to use. There's this once ubiquitous, now much loathed fist, kind of the clenched fist, and this was Oppor's logo. And USAID spent vast sums on tens of thousands of cans of spray paint, so young Yugoslavs could run around Belgrade committing vandalism. I mean, so I think there's that countercultural aspect, which draws people in. Of course, in almost any system, apart from seemingly modern day China, there is going to be a significant proportion of people who, for one reason or another, particularly if they're kind of young and impressionable, and maybe want to have a kind of rebellious streak in them, are very drawn to something that's an alternative. And so what's quite interesting, though, is that in Serbia, because of the legacy of the bulldozer revolution and the horrors it inflicted on them, and still does to this day in many ways, they are the local population is overwhelmingly suspicious of anything that is in receipt of Western funding. So at the end of last year, the not particularly popular Serbian opposition party, Serbia Against Violence, they claimed that there was widespread vote rigging in the December election, and which had penalised them while boosting the government's results. And they staged protests along with EU flags and signs written in English saying, "Please help us, Brussels." This was a kind of anathema to the overwhelming majority of the population. They were very quick to cite this study by a local NGO on election fraud in the recent vote. And if you look at this organisation's funders, they're called CRTA. It's like the British Embassy in Belgrade, the US Embassy in Belgrade, NED, USA, like it just goes on and on. I think it's Soros as well, Rockefeller Foundation. It's like the overwhelming majority of Serbs looking at that will be like, well, right, well, even if this is true, it is an attack on our country. That's how it's perceived. Not so much the same legacy in Georgia, though, interestingly. I think that Georgia, it does have a pro-Western, or at least kind of a pro-EU public that does seem to have majority support. And I must stress that yes, there is a significant NGO component here, but there is also a significant grassroots element as well, because people do want to join the EU. They find the message, of course, perpetuated by NGOs and EU leaders that this will interfere with their EU aspirations, quite frightening. But at the same time, it's different. There's a kind of chicken and egg thing where it's like, well, if this idea hadn't been falsely put in their heads, would they be worried? Blah blah. It goes on. But yes, like I think that the unrest in Georgia last year, which resulted in activists almost storming Parliament again, and this was the start of 2023. I mean, the NGO activity was much more pronounced then. Whether it's been decided to consciously to pare that back because it led a large number of people, both within and without the country, to ask, well, what's actually going on here? All of these NGOs in receipt of NED funding are telling us to protest because they might have to disclose their NED funding. That's quite suspicious. There is a pair of socialist authors from the Caucasus, Sopoko Charadze and Almut Kovansky, who wrote a very good article for Left East covering this, which is an estimable independent publication, which looked into this in some detail. I would urge your viewers to read it, because it treads on an awful lot of toes. It's led to them receiving like death threats and absolutely astonishing and appalling levels of personal abuse, because they've managed to piss off everyone by telling the truth about the situation. But it's like, I do think as well, though, that there's a point to be made, which is that one of the reasons the Georgian government is doing this is not because of a kind of a Rose Revolution style color revolution risk. It is the very real risk of an outright coup led by Georgian mercenaries and formerly associates and bodyguards of the justly jailed Saakashvili, staging an actual violent palace coup. Because that's something they're deeply concerned about. Now, Otpor, after they got bored of creating youth movements formally on the NED's dime under the Otpor name, they rebranded as Canvas, which is the center of the blah blah non-violent applied strategies. They have trained hundreds of groups all over the world in non-violent resistance and how to take down governments. They even produced a video game to teach people to do this at one stage. They continue to be headquartered in Belgrade. I mean, I would have it shut down tomorrow if I had any power, but I don't. There are some leaked emails from Stratfor, the private CIA, which were released by WikiLeaks, where there are Stratfor staffers talking about how they're working with Canvas to overthrow Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and talking about how they receive secret US funding, and they go after governments the US does not like, and they're more, when used correctly, they are more impactful and devastating than an aircraft carrier, which is quite some sales patter. But Canvas were, I think it was October last year. It might have been a bit later. Members of the Canvas's office in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, were arrested and taken in for questioning because Georgian security services had intercepted reasonable chatter or intelligence to suggest that Canvas were working with the head of the absolutely brutal Georgian Legion. I mean, this is a Georgian mercenary group which openly boasts about mutilating and murdering Russian prisoners of war. And there are many absolutely horrendous videos of what they do to bound and completely defenseless, captured Russian soldiers. And they are the darlings of NATO and Paul Massaro, who thankfully we don't hear very much from these days. But I think that the key point here is that Georgia has, since the very start of the proxy war, tried to tread a very difficult line, because they, on the one hand, they're not pro. The government led by Georgia Dream is not pro-Russian at all. They are opposing EU membership and have made it clear that the Russians probably won't like this, but they don't care. Their balancing act is not pissing off Russia, which is their very vast and considerably more powerful neighbour that gave them a pretty comprehensive thrashing in a matter of days in 2008, after Saakashvili started shelling civilian areas in the breakaway territories. But they have also tried to comply by the US sanctions regime. Its officials have condemned the invasion, and so they're trying to keep the US, EU, and Russia on side, and they've increasingly found themselves having to keep the Ukrainians on side, because the Ukrainians have demanded that they open a second front against Russia, which is something they, as I say, for very obvious historical reasons, they do not want to do, and would be very, very, very disruptive for them. Georgia has nothing like the weaponry or defenses that were gifted to Ukraine from 2014 until 2022, specifically to fight Russia with, it would be fundamentally suicidal. And apparently, the government's refusals, have not gone down well in Kiev. Now, presently, yes, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine is fighting for its life, and as you said, it is not going to exist for much longer in its present form. I strongly suspect, I think, as we discussed last time, that other countries that even members of NATO, because it's already happening, will be openly talking about seizing Ukrainian territory that was once theirs, because of course Ukraine was created by combining territory from Russia, from Romania, from Poland, even from it is a hodgepodge of all these different historic lands from that were parts of other states and countries, and I strongly suspect that if it was not for the US probably ordering them on threat of severe punishment, it's only that the Polish government would have otherwise started talking about this ages ago. That conversation is now starting to be had in Romania. Which is, and I think, I must have made this point the last time I was on your show, but when Odessa becomes Russia again, Serbia will be linked to the Black Sea and indeed Russia via the Danube. This is a long time objective of the Serbs to produce a kind of Slavic union. Now, in that context, Romania is in the way, quote unquote. So it will have kind of geopolitical decisions to make about what kind of future it wants, bearing in mind that Russia will not accept threats to its security on its doorstep, and it's made this clear by destroying Ukraine. Already there are Romanian lawmakers who have suggested, well, we could trade NATO membership for Ukrainian territory that's historically ours. I think it will surprise people how quickly that becomes mainstream. When the scale of Ukraine's defeat and indeed the West's defeat and NATO's defeat in Ukraine becomes clear, and it's getting increasgenuinely undeniable and unambiguous by the day. So there are all of these geopolitical shifts. Ukraine knows that it's in trouble. It's the British, the key sponsors and architects of this proxy war, know they're in trouble, and in that context, they would be willing to stop at almost nothing to keep it going and keep the US involved. And so, in that context, assassinations of troublesome political figures, potential revolutions. This is at the very minimum of what they would be planning and wanting to do.
Well, this is, of course, standard operating procedure once you know the tactics of British imperialism and US imperialism, but also it reflects that the European imperialist powers, such as they are becoming more and more crazed as the end becomes clear. Because we've had this discussion amongst comrades in Britain recently about the failure of EU strategic autonomy. So 20 years ago, you may remember this, Kit, as well, there was a lot of serious talk about an EU army, about the European Union becoming the counterweight or the bridge between East and West and that kind of thing. All of that has gone away. All of that is now dead. So it became completely obvious with the beginning of the Russian special military operation that the only agenda that the leaders of the EU had now, particularly in Germany and France and Italy, the major countries, was that they were going to cling to US imperialism in the hope that they would allow them basically to ride on their coattails and pick up whatever scraps of loot the US was leaving behind if it succeeded in its operation against the Russians, if it succeeds at continuing to dominate countries in Africa where the EU has a lot of obviously economic deals on the go. So all of that dream is gone, and now we face a decaying EU with the possibility that eventually the American imperialists might decide to refocus themselves in whatever they're trying to provoke in the Pacific area. Which leads not being able to fulfill their or not be able to sustain themselves as imperialist powers anymore. And that will lead the whole EU project to crash into a ditch, essentially. And so it looks to me, if looking at the Macron's contradictory threats, which he can't actually back up, that I'm going to send French troops to Odessa or something, which he can't, which he could put them there, but they wouldn't be able to do anything. David Cameron, Lord Cameron.
They could get killed. I mean, they'd be
they could die pretty quickly.
It remains one of my all-time favorite political interviews was when a French journalist rather smugly and haughtily asked a Russian diplomat, what would how would you respond if France sent 30,000 troops to Odessa? And the response was, we'll just kill them. We will just kill them. We will kill them all.
Well, what did they expect?
It speaks to the delusion. I think that like Macron, with all of his bizarre monochrome photos of himself boxing, or is it just his head superimposed onto Arnold Schwarzenegger or something? Like they genuinely still think that they are strong, independent powers. That Macron spoke of creating a dilemma by sending French troops there. I mean, that dilemma presumably being what form of artillery is used to calibrate them. But it's just like it's extraordinary to me. And I mean, I have absolutely zero hotline to the Kremlin in terms of its strategic thinking. But the idea that it takes Germany remotely seriously when German leaders are now speaking in this incredibly I'm old enough to remember all of 5 years ago when Germany was considered a sensible, sober country run by intelligent people who acted in their nation's best interest, and that was the established narrative. They have amply demonstrated themselves to be a bunch of like self-destructive total morons with absolutely zero autonomy or independence of thought or even the vaguest shred of intelligence or foresight at all. German officials are openly talking about how they're screwed and we've got many lost decades ahead of us. There are academic studies being published showing that Germany had, after imposing the sanctions on Russia, suffered its worst economic hit since the 1950s, and it's created all sorts of economic problems. It's ravaged Germany's industry. And where in German politics is any debate outside the AfD about ending the sanctions and admitting that they were a mistake? Like where? It's just remarkable. It's remarkable to me. You see it in a lot of. I mean, I keep an eye on the German media, and they will frequently have articles about Germany's economic woes that use phrases like energy shock or due to higher energy prices. And it's like, well, why is that? What happened? Why are they higher? I mean, Sunak's trying to push the line now that Putin made our energy higher. I mean, just in that context, when you are Russia, you have, by some estimations, the largest and indeed fastest growing and best performing economy, not just in Europe, but in almost the entire world. When you have the Spectator publishing articles stating Russians have never had it so good and talking about record consumer spending, the Western media is increasingly acknowledging that what the sanctions have done is push Russians together and unite them in a way that they haven't been since the end of, long before the end of communism. And they also have the world's leading military production industry in tandem with China's groundbreaking world-leading technology. And you're going to take Germany seriously? Like really?
Why would you?
Its primary exports being beer and not particularly great sausages now. Literally. That's it.
The EU is coming. It's clearly a project which is coming to an end. You can see it now. My own impression is that it will probably fall apart in its current form within a decade, which will leave, of course, an awful lot of the ruling classes in the central and east of Europe cast adrift. Given all these bozos, these sort of quasi-fascist cranks in the Baltics, in Poland, in Croatia, in various other countries of the former Yugoslavia, all tied themselves to this project and to NATO and to US imperialism for the last 30 years. So their power is coming to an end. But as you said, they are willing to do almost anything to try and cling on. So that includes things like stirring up trouble in a place like Kosovo, for instance, which remains very much on the boil. So I wanted to ask your impressions of what is it? Are the British and the Americans likely to make some sort of move there to compel Vucic to do his usual acrobatic flips between east and west, to come down harder on the western side, because it seems that the visit of Xi Jinping to Belgrade recently was about solidifying Serbia's presence within the Belt and Road Initiative and within the plans that the Chinese have. And of course, as you said, if the Russians achieve a bridge to Serbia, essentially by having access to the Danube, then that's essentially the isolation of Serbia ended, or potentially ended. So they need to do something soon to try and pull something off here. So what is the likelihood, you think, of them trying something more extreme in Kosovo, or any other sort of plans that they might have to make trouble in the former Yugoslavia that would bring problems to Vucic which he couldn't easily solve?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in Bosnia and in Kosovo, these are key flashpoints to watch, because it would be easy because these countries, if you can call them that, are crawling with British peacekeepers, quote unquote, who are there to prevent against Russian aggression. Whose soldiers have invaded. Sorry, so I mean, they are a cause of very, very serious concern. Particularly given the ease with which, I mean, Kurti is this insane nationalist who's leading Kosovo. I mean, the WikiLeaks cables are full of references to US officials finding him terrifying and difficult to deal with, and he's now leading Kosovo. There is much cause for concern. He has, over the past, well, ever since coming into office 2 years ago, he has been using all sorts of psychological engaging in psyops, stoking fears of Serbian invasion, stoking fears of Serbian paramilitaries, including disseminating fake videos and all sorts of bizarre tactics. He has the motive, he has the means to do this, particularly given the US is pivoting away from Europe, but the Balkans in particular. I think they've just had enough of dealing with these quarrels in a faraway land between peoples of whom we know nothing. So that is a concern. But while I do think the likelihood, or the odds of Britain pulling some stunt to try and maintain US presence in the Balkans is quite high, you've got to bear in mind that the British at this stage are as dependent on the US to keep their lights on as Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo are. It's that level of dependency, and I don't think that they would get very far. Particularly, it's quite clear from a lot of the messaging around Nord Stream, I would say, where officials have, certain Western officials have hinted very strongly that we know who did this, and if something like this was to happen again, we maybe wouldn't keep quiet about it. That was messaging to Britain, you need to drop this now. We need to stop engaging in all of these incendiary acts, because, as we reported on at the Grey Zone in some detail, it is British military intelligence officials who are behind the destruction of Kerch Bridge, who are pushing for the US to escalate, who are doing everything they can to keep the US plugged into this when they don't want to be, and they want to step away. The consequences for Britain, if it tries again to act unilaterally to spark a new conflict, could be dire, in fact, and they might not get anything that they want. Another thing that in terms of, as we near the end of this program, rational hope springing eternal, I think Xi's visit to Serbia was historic. It was highly significant, and I think that it was almost unique in terms of Xi's visits to other countries. He gave a public address. There were tens of thousands of patriotic Serbs who came along to watch it, who were hanging on his every word. It is clear that he has a commitment to Serbia, and a deep affinity for the country and its people. And also the scale of Chinese investment and infrastructure in Serbia is wild. This is a country where NATO destroyed significant proportions of its train system. And now China is building high-speed rail connecting every part of it with one another, with any luck. That's going to be a huge game changer, both in terms of, I think, boosting tourism and opening up Serbia to the wider region, but also, like locking the country into a wider infrastructure where they are perhaps even impervious to, say, Western sanctions, which is something that's been threatened a lot at Vucic recently to get into twist his arm. Now, in that context, when you have Serbia and Russia reunited, so to speak, and you have China's enduring commitment to maintaining Serbia as an independent country, perhaps US and EU influence in Serbia collapses just by the sheer weight of gravity. They cease to have any clout whatsoever. Already, the overwhelming majority of the population don't trust them. There is, if you look at polls, it's something like only 20% of young, I think it's less than that, might be like 15% of young Serbs are very, very supportive, are strongly supportive of joining the EU. And this is after being bombarded with very slick and expensive pro-EU propaganda for decades. It's like, and they don't want it. So I think as well, another thing that gives me hope is that the Serbs are, they're extremely wise to all of this skullduggery, and they're picking the hill that they die on, perhaps quite literally, very, very, very carefully. And they know that how easy it would be for them to be used as pawns in a wider geopolitical ploy or plot, because it's happened so often before. The one bitten twice, multiply bitten, now very, very, very shy. So they're extremely, extremely cautious not to take drastic action. But I think if and when the time comes, that there will be a significant backlash.
Yes, I think we are entering into the end times for the Western hegemonic alliance, and interesting times to be doing this kind of work that you're doing, and the kind of coverage we're doing here. Now, hitting the top of the hour, so I think we'll draw the conversation to a close.
Yeah.
But before we log off, Kit, I wanted to just give you a chance to talk about the new podcast that you're doing and your presence on other platforms. So if you just want to give a plug to the other projects you're working on at the moment, and anything else you want to mention before we log off.
Yeah, sure. So I've launched a new podcast it's kind of an investigative podcast. We shit on the deep state, so you don't have to. It's called Active Measures, and you can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Telegram, and we have a Substack where we publish our video discussions and investigations. It'd be great to see you there. You have my website, which is just kitklerenberg.com. I'm seemingly permanently banned from Twitter. While that's a shame, also it's good for my mental health. So, I mean, maybe you might consider not being on Twitter with me one way or another. But God bless you. Have me on, my brother. Take care. Speak soon.
All right. Cheers and good night.
You too.
All right. So that was Kit Klarenberg joining us all the way from Serbia. Thanks to him. Thanks to all of you who've tuned in for this one. I will be back later this evening at 10:30 British time with a look at Putin's visit to Beijing. So I hope you can join me for that. But until then, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again later today.